Hello everyone, in this tutorial we're going to be setting up some grass. We'll be making a patch of grass using Vellum. We're going to simulate it and have a collision object deform it and have it stay in place using the plasticity parameters. This one was requested by one of my patrons whose name I unfortunately cannot pronounce, but thank you very much for the request. This is the reference he showed me. It's some sort of a patch of grass with a dynamic ball rolling over it, deforming the grass, and the grass retains that deformed shape once the ball's rolled over it. I'll aim to create something similar to this, but probably just with a bit more of a simplified patch of grass. Okay, let's dive in. Okay, to create our patch of grass, we'll start from a blank Houdini scene, so I've got an empty scene open. And let's start off by creating a geometry node to contain our setup. Call this grass, and we'll jump inside, and first thing I'll do is create a grid. This is going to be our base for our patch of grass. I'll make it 4 by 4 meters, and I'll scatter some points on that. The points are going to be where our grass is going to be. And I just want to add a normal as well for the copy that's about to follow. So to point normals. And I'll create a copy to points. And this is going to be, we're going to copy some lines over, which are going to be our strands of grass. So to do that, I'll create a line sop. And I'll give the line 10 point divisions. And I'll create a group node. And I'll plug that in to the line. I'll set it to point group and call it root. And I just want to group point 0 to be the root point. That's what we're going to use to constrain our lines. And you can see the orientation is wrong. So we just need to set up our direction to be Z. Now we get some lines pointing upwards, but it doesn't look very much like grass yet. To do that, I think we need to add a little bit of variation and add some bending. I'll get an attribute adjust float. And that one's already set to P scale. It disappears because it's 0 by default. So I just want to set that to noise, and then we just lift up this minimum value. Maybe something like that. So we have a little bit of breakup in our grass. And then to bend it, I'm going to borrow from one of the guide room sops. And it's called guide process bend. Type bend, you'll see guide process bend. And stick that into the copy to points. By default, it's not going to work because it's expecting some other attributes. I'll set it up to direction curve attribute, and I'll set it to cross product with root tangent normal. And you can see it's still not working because we don't have any directional attribute. So to create that attribute on the points, I'm going to use another attribute adjust, and this time I'm going to get a vector. So I'll get attribute adjust vector, and I'm just going to copy that attribute name, which is bender for bend direction. Paste it in there so we know we've got the attribute. And I just want to display it, so I'll middle click and I'll click on bend direction. And again, it's a constant of 0, so just set it to random. And it's displaying as color. I want it to display as a vector, so I'm going to edit the way it gets displayed with the edit visualizer. And I'll just set this to be a marker, and that marker needs to be vector. So now we're getting a random attribute in all axes, but it's positive, and I want it to be 0 centered. So now it's going in any direction, but I don't want it in Y, I just want it in X and Z, so I'll turn off Y. Now we get this random flat vector, which is what we want to use for our bend direction. But I also want to normalize it, so I'll enable post process and make the vector unit length. Now if we go back, now I can turn off that visualization. We should see something if we select the guide process now. This is starting to look a bit more like strands of grass. I'll give it a bit more bend and maybe a little bit of randomness as well. They're all not bending the same way. And just for visualization for the tutorial, I'm going to thicken up those lines a bit. So I'll go to visualize, or no, go to geometry, and I'll set my Y width to 2. So the strands are a bit more readable, so they're a bit thicker now. They're also all one color, which isn't easy to see. So I'll get another attribute adjust. And this time I want to call the primitive. I'll just call this attribute call color. But this is just going to be a float that I'm going to use in a ramp afterwards. And I'll just set it to random. And that's just giving me a random 0 to 1 value. I can get a color node. And it can ramp attribute. I want that to be primitive. And I want to, is this one primitive? Yes, it is. Cool. It's showing me the point attributes, I think. Type in call. There we go. And the reason I'm randomizing my primitive is I want each of the primitives to have the same color. Otherwise, if it was set to points, it would just be a mess. Okay, now we can give it some grassy colors. Make a few green ones. Get another shade of green in there. Maybe another one, which is a bit more yellow. Brighten it up a bit as well. Maybe a few more almost bluish ones, very bright. Now I've got a bit more breakup in there. You can kind of sort of differentiate between the different curves a bit better. Okay, now we've got that sorted. It's time to turn this into some Vellum strands. So I'll get a Vellum configure hair. I'm going to use hair to simulate the strands. I'll plug that in, and then we can get a Vellum solver as well. And we hook up the hair to the solver. And I'll set the sub-steps to 4 just because there's probably some intercollisions and there's a lot of strands there. We've got some gravity, we don't have any wind. The rest we can all leave as default for now, I think. I want to turn on the ground plane as well to collide them later where they get squished. And on the hair themselves, I want to use that root group that I created to pin the strands to ground. Okay, so that's working. And I want to add a wind force. So I'll get a pop wind. And with this pop wind, I'll set the air resistance to 0.2 or something. And I'll make the amplitude 3. Let's turn on the guide so we can see what our noise looks like. And this is a bit too broken up to me. I'll reduce roughness a bit and increase the swirl size. So it looks like bigger gusts of wind traveling through it. The ground plane's a bit in the way, but you can more or less see the kind of shapes it's making. And I think that's probably going to move too quickly as well. Set like a pulse length of 3.5, so it moves a bit slower through the noise. I can turn off the guide again, jump up and hit play and see what our patch of grass is doing. Okay, we can see it's simulating and falling in different directions, and it looks a bit like spaghetti now, which is pretty cool if we wanted to be creating spaghetti. So we're gonna need to up some of our stiffness values. On the hair, I'll go to the bend stiffness, and I'll jump up 2 decimals to 0.1, maybe increase the stiffness to something like 3. And let's see if our graph still falls over. Okay, I let it sim for a couple of frames, and this is what our grass looks like. It's holding its shape nicely, and I like how the frequency of the wind force is looking. I probably just want to increase the strength of it a little bit. So let's do that and add our collision sphere. Okay, I'll dive into the solver, and let's bump this up all the way to 5. And for the collision, I'm just going to start off with an animated collision. So I'll create a sphere, set our display flag to that, and I want to set it to polygons and increase the divisions something like 8, so it's nice and smooth. And then I'm just going to template the grass so we can see how big this is. Just taking up a fairly big chunk, so I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, I think. And then I'll create a transform, which is going to be used for the animation to move the sphere around. So I'll move it up to above the ground. I'm just going to go to the side view. Just put it somewhere like that. Let's go back to perspective. And then I'm just going to animate this. So I'll go to already on the first frame, set a key. I want to change my timeline. For this, I don't need that many frames. So I'll set it 25 FPS and just make it 120 frames. I'll go to around frame 80, drag it across, and it's auto keyed, but I'll just key everything. So now I've got some animation on that. Let's hit play. I'll set my playback to real time. Okay, I think that's moving fast enough. So I can go into the third input as our collision object. After the Vellum solver, I'll get a clean sop. Just get rid of some of these attributes, because there's a ton of attributes on there now, and don't really need most of it at the moment. Just do something like that. Keep CD and maybe keep V for in case I forget later. And P scale as well. Always good to keep P scale. And I'll drop down a polywire. So I think that's probably going to be a bit more easy to read. Set that to key scale. And we might have to promote CD so it goes over to the polywire. So we'll get attribute promote. And I want to promote CD from primitive to points. So we're looking a little bit dark. But at least we can see if our collisions are working. And might be worth adding a light in there. Okay, that should do the trick. And let's see what this looks like with the collision. Okay, this is what a simulation looks like. You can see the grass is colliding nicely with the sphere, but it just kind of pops back into shape after it's being freed from the collision. So now let's make this bend and keep its shape. To do that, I'm going to go back to our Vellum here and turn on enable plasticity in the bend constraints. And there's 3 parameters here: threshold, rate, and hardening. Threshold is how far it bends before it starts making it plastic, and what that means, it's going to make it creep towards this new rest position. Rate is how quickly that's going to change, and hardening means it's going to stiffen the constraint in the new position. So the stiffness is going to go up based on the hardening. We're going to leave that one at default because we don't need that. And I'll leave these at default for the first run just so we can see what result we get. So let's see what that looks like. And this is a result of the new simulation. You can see now that it's deforming the grass, and you can see the path that it leaves in the grass. Like, it's slightly bent, but it's not completely flattened out. So what that means is we probably need the rate of it to be faster and maybe lower the threshold as well. So close this one, and the sphere is traveling through pretty quickly. So let's bump up this rate to 5. So once plasticity kicks in, it's going to act quickly. And I'll reduce the threshold to something like 8. So it doesn't have to bend as much before plasticity kicks in. Okay, and let's see what that result looks like. Okay, and this is the new result. You can see now it's really flattening out the grass and leaving a path as you would expect. And you can see, even though the grass gets bent into a new position, it's still being pushed around by the wind forces. If you want them to get even stiffer when they're in that position, that's where you'll start increasing this hardening value. In this case, I'm pretty happy with this result. So I still want them to wave around, because I still want them to wave around in the wind. And you can see this is still cached, so let me jump through. See, it's making a really nice little path in there for push them around. Maybe 1 or 2 at the back there that weren't pushed enough for it to completely be flat on the ground. But that's how you would use the plasticity settings to bend some grass. It's fairly simple. As a bonus, let's see if we can take our ball and turn it into a dynamic object and make it a weird squishy ball like the one in the reference. I'm going to copy this transform to create some new animation, but keep the old one. So I'm going to set my template on the grass just so I can see that and view this new transform. create some new animation. And then I'm going to give myself a couple of extra frames. So like middle click and middle click drag that keyframe over. So you get 100 frames to work with. And I'll go to around frame 18, maybe frame 20, and lower down the sphere a bit. So I'll go to 0.18 because I want to push it into the ground so that it collides with the ground and gets squished. And then we go to around frame 80 and do the same thing. And I've got auto key turned on, so it's keying automatically. You can see we get this dipping animation, and then it lifts back up. Okay, so we got some new animation working. Next up, we want to turn it into a cloth. So I'll get a configure cloth. But I want it to be very squishy, so I'm going to adjust some of these constraint attributes. I'm going to set the stretch stiffness really low. I'm going to go down to something like 10 so that it can stretch in and out and it's not really trying to rigidly maintain its shape. And for the bend stiffness, I'm going to do the opposite and make it stiffer. Just so it doesn't go completely wrinkly on me. And then I think that's all the settings I want to change on this one. Then I also want to add another Vellum constraint. 2 more constraints actually. So I'll get Vellum constraint node and I'm just going to copy it to make 2 of them. Do the same with that if I don't misclick it. And I want to add a pressure constraint. This is just going to help it keep its shape a little bit. I'll set that one to pressure. And then for the pressure, I'm going to lower this constraint as well. I'll set it to around 1000. And I'm going to up the rest scale so that it inflates slightly. Should give me a nice shape. And then the last one is going to be the constraint that sticks that to the animation, and I'm just going to do it with a soft pin. So I'm going to change this to where is that? Pin to target. And I don't want to change this because I just want to pin all the points. And I'll set it to soft. And this constraint I'm going to lower as well. I'll set this to 1. I'll up the bend stiffness to 1 as well. That's just going to try and pull it along with the animation. And I also need to remember to turn on match animation. Okay, and I'm going to make a bit of space and let's see what this one does on its own. So I'm just going to bypass the grass for now. Turn off that template. And let's make a capture of this. Yeah, we can see that's kind of working, but I didn't add any rotation. So it's just kind of dragging on the ground. So in there, I'm just going to set a keyframe at 0 and go to 100. And that's simulating. So I'm just going to hit escape, go up, and then at 100, I'm just going to kind of guess it and go for like 720. So it's doing a couple of revolutions as it goes along. That should hopefully give us a better animation. Cool. We know that's working now, so let's get a merge node, copy that one so we can combine our grass with our dynamic ball. Put all those in together, and we don't need this one anymore. And then for the polywire we've got down there, I'm just going to need a group for the grass as well. Get a group node. and I'll call it grass. And then on the clean, I just need to remember to keep the grass. I've already put that in there, so that's good to go. And then on the solver, because it's a little bit more complicated, I'm going to set my constraint iterations to 200 and maybe add like 2 more collision passes, which should hopefully give us a clean enough simulation. There's one other thing I want to do, and that's change how the grass root constraint is working. But let me play a couple of frames before I change it so you can see the difference. Right now the constraint is set to match animation. I think, yeah, it's pinned, though the root's pinned and then the orientation is pinned as well, but it's a stiff pin. I'll check the correct name now, but let's just give that a couple of frames. You can see the simulation is working pretty well. Let's stop it around there. You can see these base points keep pointing upwards while the rest of the grass gets flattened out. If we want that to lay down flat on the ground as well as it gets pushed, we can change this, because we see we've got this permanent constraint on the roots, and that's permanently pinning the root point to the ground. We can change the way the orientation works. If we set it to none, they're all just going to collapse. But if we set it to soft and we re-simulate this, you can already see a little bit of change there. Right, let's change the view to the side. Maybe go a bit closer as well. Go down there. And I'll do a capture and let this cook, and hopefully we should see the grass completely flattening of our wobbly sphere pushing through it. Okay, the simulation finished, and this is what it looks like. We can see our grass is still staying upright and blowing in the wind, while the ones where our squishy ball, which almost looks like a droplet, goes through, gets completely flattened. And I can stop that one and give you a different angle if I just go through there. And you can see now, because we changed that constraint, some of them still kind of stay upright, so they don't have space to move into. But you can see they're being flattened even all the way to the base. And I think I might have neglected to mention this step at the bottom as well. I was doing some testing just to see how to split them before the spider is already in there. So all I'm doing is I'm using the group that I made for grass, splitting between the ball and the grass there, so that this gets polywired, while on this side I'm taking the sphere that's coming in and just subdividing it a bit and smoothing it a little bit. Okay, and that's it for this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching. Bye. If you want to see more videos like this, go check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Zabrand, or follow me on Vimeo. And if you're not a Patreon yet, please consider subscribing and gaining access to some Patreon-only content. And as always, to all my patrons, thank you very much. I can't do this without you guys.